All right, so here's Jason Hagler, if I'm pronouncing that correct. Our next talk on writing. Where does writing come from?
Yeah, so basically what I'm doing is sort of throwing my PhD research into a conlanging environment and sort of looking at the question of where writing systems come from, how they develop, and um, also then trying to use conlanging and conworlding as kind of a thought experiment, right? And so when we talk about where writing comes from, right, if we look at Tolkien, right? Well, you got this incredibly good looking elven dude who kind of sits down and says, I'm going to represent sound, right? Or if you talk to the Egyptians, they say, okay, well, this, bird headed bloke said, all right, we're going to do it this way. And maybe it was touching some big pieces of stone and, hopping around with Grigori Ligeti in the background. Or maybe it was these guys, who brought writing to Earth. But the short answer is it's kind of something bureaucrats do by accident. And the process and potentials involved in this are actually pretty interesting. And I think by looking through this, um, we get some new parameters to experiment with in coming up with stuff if we kind of take a historical process. So what I'm doing here is basically Kerbal State Formation Program. It's like Kerbal Space Program where you send these adorable little green people up into space and um, sometimes they die horribly, but hopefully not. But it's got more swords, sheep, and human sacrifice. The three big S's really. So again, it's sort of trying this as a thought experiment. Hence, our wonderful little map with the sea here, different resources like in Marlakan over here. You got tin, sulfur, and obsidian. The merchants are sailing back and forth and back and forth, and copper eventually comes in from up here. And the stars of our story, the Tlowat and the city of Hlakash is around here somewhere in this Rift Valley by lakes. So I guess a quick story. So here's how Tuk'an became the Lord of Ngichage, right? So Tuk'an was out wandering one day because that seems to be the kind of thing that divine beings do at the beginning of the cosmos, right? Think about your Popol Vuh or whatever. And of course, everyone tells it differently. But he meets a bunch of animals who either give him something or trade him something like a fetch quest, or they give him bad directions, you know, and he kind of ends up getting completely lost and no idea where he is. And in the end, he ends up in Vichak, which is the underworld. And because of what he's got, he actually manages to become king. And he really didn't plan any of it. But by the time he got there, he actually had everything he needed to become king of Vichak. And so, yeah, the reason talking about this is because I'm going to suggest that the invention of writing is kind of like this. And so, and now for something completely different. The Cambrian explosion! I think 500 million years ago. Uh, don't don't get too hard on me if I get that wrong, but you get all kinds of crazy creatures, and this is the explosion of animal life, and you get all these weird different body plans, and opabinia, actually, no, sorry, opabinia here, hallucigenia. We weren't even sure which side was up on the damn thing. Trilobites, like you name it, right? And it's this huge variety that seems to kind of come out of nowhere, and then most of these things don't really leave descendants. And so what's going on is that this is Gouldian evolutionary theory, and that's why I'm referencing it, because there's this evolutionary biologist, Stephen Jay Gould, who oddly enough does not have a really deep voice or glowing eyes, which doesn't make sense to me. But he talks about evolutionary biology and the idea that evolution isn't quite survival of the fittest, but rather is based on contingency and making use of what's already there. So evolution cannot be understood apart from its environment. So, why did dinosaurs go extinct? Well, it wasn't because they were obsolete. It's because there was massive ecological disruption that ended up negatively impacting the bigger creatures. So a good example of this stuff is hands, fins, and wings, right? So ultimately, the human hand comes from fish fins, right? And it doesn't really make sense. You're kind of looking at it going like, how the heck did that happen? And then if you kind of see some of the intermediary steps, and understand what's going on in the context with it. With the coelacanths kind of crawling along the bottom of the ocean. You can't really see the weird, awkward motions that I'm making, but trust me, I'm making weird, awkward motions like a coelacanth. And then you get Tiktaalik here with the rearrangement of the pre-existing bones into fingers, or things that eventually become fingers, right? And once you've got the thing, you can just repurpose the things that you already have, and it depends on the environment, right? The human hand is completely useless in the ocean, and a bat wing would be completely useless for crawling around like a cat. But it's because of this whole process and reusing and recycling what we have that we now have hands that can type and write. At the same time, right? Look at these chimps, right? Well, what's his problem? Where's his copy of Titus Andronicus, right? Monkey typewriter. There should be Shakespeare, but he seems to have pulled out the ribbon, and that's because the hands don't develop on their own, right? There's also correlated things going on in the brain and the nervous system, in culture, and so the bones become the thing that we can really see. Writing is kind of like bones, it's the part that we can see, but there's all of this stuff that needs to be going on in the background. So, to kind of get where I'm going and to kind of start off this thing, let's kind of start with a little imaginary case study here. Right? Right, so, for the purposes of this, to make it easier to see, I'm going to kind of I'm going to focus on agency of actors in it as innovating. Whereas in all probability, it's more of a gradual process where nobody even realizes that they've come up with something new. But so let's say your tribe has ruined your perfectly good day of mammoth hunting by making you babysit the children, right? And the elders say, oh, it's an educational enrichment excursion. Right? And you're like, okay, fine. But you can't lose any of the damn children. So you got to keep count of them, right? But they're children. They're running around. They're really annoying. So how do you do that, right? Well, the answer I'm fishing for is finger counting. So we're going to look at this and we're going to go, oh, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But that's not the only way to do it. You could also do 1, 2, 3, 4. And there are languages and cultures where people do that and they have base 4 number systems. Or some very clever people go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And they have base 12 number systems. Meanwhile, in New Guinea, they are counting, starting with the little finger on one side and then going up the body and using each of these different points to represent a number. And they have a base 27 number system. Now, of course, in making whatever decision you did, you didn't just single-handedly set the base for your community and all descendants. But, the basic idea here is that these simple, seemingly innocuous practices end up having ripple effects. And so let's leap ahead to the late Neolithic, right? And that's roughly 5,000 to 3,000 BC, depending on where you are. Climate really plays a major role in this. And plants and animals have been domesticated. We start getting stratified societies. The population centers are increasing in size rather than fissioning. You've got specialized craftsmen. You've got specialized agriculture, all kinds of things. And you also have architecture that seems to be being used for different purposes. So this is a model of a Neolithic Chinese village in the one on Tiananmen, the big museum in Beijing, right there across from Renmin Datang. And so, you got like a little residential house, and then you got these big things. And so what are those, right? And then you also got granaries. And all of this gives rise to a couple of related questions, right? Well, you got the society. How do you calculate, right? You got to keep track of grain and distribution of that. So there's a couple of different potential answers, right? Well, obviously you can use your fingers to a certain extent, but that you kind of run out of fingers eventually. So you can start doing things like making little clay tokens. And this is something that we see in Mesopotamia, where you get differently shaped clay tokens to represent different commodities. You can also use counting sticks. And by using those, you can actually kind of do, it's akin to an abacus. Or in the Ryukyus, actually up until like the 1920s, they were still using these things called warazum, which were knotted straw and string that by using the unlike the Kipu, we actually know exactly how these things work because we had people on hand to explain the whole process. So you could basically give someone a tax receipt and tell them when it was due, and then have the interest rate indicated. And then also there's the question of, how do you store that information? Once you've kind of done your calculations. Well, in Mesopotamia, you're taking clay balls and you're putting, oh yeah, Kipu stuff, super fascinating. I have a whole other talk about that, but I'm gonna, I got a time limit, right? So these clay balls, bullae, you could put the counters inside of it to save the data to protect it from being tampered with. And then at some point they realized, oh, we can poke the clay ball with them, and then we'll be able to keep track from the outside without opening it up, right? But then you also can do things, quipus, right, with your knots. And then you can actually do tally sticks. And actually, one of the ways that you could submit your taxes in England up until the late 18th century was with tally sticks, with carved things. And when you cut the stick, everyone gets, the two parties each get a copy of it. And the fire at the House of Parliament that actually led to the building of Big Ben in 1823 in London, of course, was because they finally got around to burning all of the old medieval tally sticks. And so, let's go back to late Neolithic Hlakash, right? Well, Hlakash now has several thousand people. You have rice, millet, squash, pigs, chickens, ducks, cows, roe deer, which are semi-domesticated, fish, turtles, you name it, right? And there's producing things in silk. They've got reeds to make stuff out of wood, clay. That's what you got on hand. And again, there's this question of how do you use your materials, right? Because in Mesopotamia, you're using the clay as your writing material. And in addition to that, right, there's certain trade goods that are now in vogue for purposes of display status. And of course, everyone also always needs salt. And then, of course, right now, oh man, it's horrible. The Choseks of Tuk'an are, hunting in your forest, which they claim are actually theirs because, the eldest tree placed their ancestor Napak at the head of the first Tlowat feast. And they're like, ugh, it's nonsense. Because, everyone knows that didn't host that feast, Tuk'an did. And, the Tlowat doesn't even enter into it. The forest belongs to, our city because of a pact, right? So you've got disagreements, and there's all these different factors in the culture. And so in terms of the symbolic and record-keeping needs of this society, right? Well, one, the elites are going to want to look powerful and Chosek-like. Right? And Choseks are elite rulers, nobles. Eventually, the term becomes roughly equivalent to king. You want to keep track of alliances. You want to keep track of those silks so you can trade in them. You want to keep track of the livestock and harvests. You want basically inventory control, deals and contracts, and prestige. Now, also consider for a moment that the people in Atalatakok, which sounded like a good idea when I came up with it a while ago, but they live on the coast and they're the ones who import the obsidian from Marlakan across the sea, have similar needs, but they also need navigation aids. And so in their case, they'll actually end up doing Kipu type things as star charts. Whereas further inland, well, you don't really need that. So Hlakash ends up, because it has lots of wood and bamboo, they end up focusing on these tallies. And you can use string like abacus or abakai in part because of what their trade contacts are doing. And then they're also using designs on textiles and pots. And I'm going to focus on the visual side here because I'm still working on wrapping my head around how Kipu type technologies actually operate. So let's kind of leap ahead here 500 years, right? And so we're in the early Bronze Age. We got new metal with new trade patterns, exponential feedback from agriculture. Painters are starting to do something really interesting, which is recycling ways of depicting things. And so they're using symbols and icons. So for example, the Tuk'an cycle is very important. So you start getting representations of spiders, and they get very good at representing spiders. And that's the way that you know that it's Tuk'an as opposed to someone else, because the little person has a spider next to them. And of course, well, why would you draw a kichai, a spider, next to a person? Well, it's because Tuk'an rides around on a spider. And that's how you know it's him. Or for example, with Damok and Chalad, who are people were at first enemies and then become the best of friends, kind of like Gilgamesh. Well, the way that you know it's Demolk is because he's got that oar, because he comes across the sea, right? And Tlowat has his spear, or the arms of Tenga, right? Tenga, his arms wide, giving you stuff and saying hi. Oh yeah, oh yeah, it's Shaka when the walls fell. And then you also get little things like looms, right? And so you get this pars pro toto representation where you're using just part of something to represent the whole thing. And you then can also start tagging data using these techniques. So for example, if you're working in string, you can use red strings to represent copper, or you can introduce dates with a specific number. Whereas painting, you can use these different symbols, and the connection becomes stronger as the symbols become stylized. And this actually is a really important process in human cognition, because what we're actually doing when we're reading is recycling these visual processing parts of the brain to use abstract and stylized representations to trigger a semantic prime and a phonological prime. But then, you get the question of, well, like, how do you represent what you can't draw? And so you get a couple of different solutions depending on where you are. So for example, everyone probably is familiar with the ideogram, right? Well, that arrow, right? Well, this side up, or the circle with the X through it, no whatevers. And then but you can also do up, and similarly, right? You can have a picture of a head, a pictogram of a head, and you can have a picture of a rationing vessel or a piece of bread, and then you can also stick them together. And this is what happens in Mesopotamia, where the Sog head and the Ninda bread or vessel get put together for gu, which is disbursement or eating. It can mean a couple of different things. You can also use things just for their sound value. So this is Oracle Bone Chinese. This is a picture of a basket, but it's being used to represent the sound T, or what is now pronounced T. Back in the day, it would have been like, or something like that. Old Chinese is a bit odd, or very different from modern Chinese. And so perhaps we will receive the harvest. But the other thing you can do is you can stick together something that's used for its sound value with something that's being used for its semantic value. So these are feet, and those are used to indicate verbs of motion. The upside down one indicates that it's motion directed towards the speaker, and this grain up here is pronounced something like "mrai." And so if you have something that sounds like "mrai" that is a verb of motion towards you, it's the word "mice" to come. And in general, when Old Chinese, Ancient Chinese scribes are kind of faced with the situation, this is what they're going to tend to do. Early Uruk period Mesopotamian scribes are going to tend to make compound ideograms, whereas and then at Hlakash, right? Well, here's your spider, and it's got a little thing coming out of its butt. What do spiders, make? Silk. It's talking about silk. It's talking about weaving. And so then you get this question of ledgers and contracts, right? Because just because you figured out how to write these abstract things or indicate these abstract things doesn't mean that you've really got writing. And people tend to put Mesopotamia in its own box because of how abstract cuneiform ends up looking. But at the outset, it's in pictorial registers and is always deployed alongside them. So what's interesting here is, right, these are little banners that represent sacred precincts, probably Inanna. And here's your cuneiform sign for Inanna. It's that rotated 90 degrees. And so here's your little two udu, two sheep, and something about the Temple of Inanna. And then you're not necessarily indicating anything particularly clearly, because the user knows what the context is. They know what it means. Similarly, in ancient Egypt, you've got so this is the Narmer plaque, which is one of the earliest pieces of writing from ancient Egypt. And you got the guy's name up here. You got the guy's name up here, I got the guy's name down here. But it's also in this very pictorial context. And so at Hlakash, what you end up doing is you end up kind of taking a piece of wood or bamboo, writing or drawing a picture of whatever the commodity is. So, something that comes in a jar, some kind of grain, and then you write your little numbers or your little tallies, right? So this is 83 units of some kind of jarred commodity, and this is 37 units of this particular grain, which in this case is rice. And then to kind of help with that, especially because it ends up getting split, you can then hang like a string with the knots in it, or you can add additional indications here. And the person who is giving stuff gets the knots because that allows them to, it makes it easier for that record keeping purpose. And then you want your name as symmetrical as possible in this particular case, in this culture. So we've got that going on, and we're doing that for a while. And then we get another moment, right? Year 15 of the Chosek Tlowat, at the second. And so eventually you get a moment of political consolidation where finally those jerks over up in the Nakan recognize that we really own the forest, which is obvious. So we got to make a treaty, right? Because Tlowat wants a treaty tally to record this and to make it so that way they can't weasel out of it. But one of the things is that Nakan wants help against the Trascan. And we don't really want to give them carte blanche to call us into their wars. So we really only want to do defensive actions only. And we also want to make it clear that we own the forest. Well, how do we do this, right? Now we have to indicate relationships between agents and actors in our records, right? So like here, there isn't really any indication of the relationship. Same with the cuneiform. And so the Sumerian solution to this is to basically use little non-linguistic markers and format to mark that. So in this survey of a field, well, you've got the numbers here, and then you've got this, which indicates that it's with the width or the length, and then you've got this other dimension over here indicating that it's the width, and they keep them in individual little cases, right, in your spreadsheet. Similarly, you've got your different officials with their own little cases, and then you have something indicating, oh, it's dispersal. And part of what's going on is that Sumerian is a highly inflected language, and they're just writing the roots. And so the early texts seem to be using structural cues to tell you what's going on. In ancient Egyptian, they got this whole non-concatenative morphology thing going on, kind of like a Semitic language, where like QTL has something to do with killing, but the way that you put in the vowels tells you what it is. And so ancient Egyptian writing relies on syntax and particles to tell you. Word order is very, very important. So what they're doing is they're writing things that are part of the words. Ner, mer, narm. Nature, God, house, temple. The way that you know that there are two obelisks is because there's two obelisks. And the way that you know the adjective goes with it is because it's got the little two there, so it goes together. But this e ending or re ending would tell you that it's an adjective. In Old Chinese is probably sequisyllabic affixes for derivation, and they rely on syntax and particles to write things. So testing, perhaps, or irrealis, or hypothetical, or optative maybe. If/when the king recovers, it will be so like a focus marker. Cows, aspect marker, continue to sacrifice to ancestor day 1 at this place. And if you scramble the order, there are certain scrambling things that you can do because of these particles. but you can't do anything you want. Otherwise, you'll end up totally lost. Then you also have this question of graph to Lexeme relationship. So in Sumerian, one graph represents multiple words in a semantic cluster, right? So here you got your mouth sign, and it can be mouth, which is copied, but it can also be the tooth, because this is like a drawing of a face with the mouth hashed. And zu sounds like the word zuh, to steal. Also, your nose is in that area. Well, nose sounds like hyena, but what do you do with your mouth? Well, you speak, okay? So you can use it to represent that word and that sound, or the voice, or the word. So you got, again, the semantic cluster associated with the graph. It's really, in a lot of ways, it's sort of an ideographic writing system. Whereas hieroglyphics, you've got this very high redundancy system, and I'm going to try to wrap this up, where you have your sound marking, but you have it like, you know, and it's the god that sounds like that. Oh, it's Kepler. Whereas in Chinese, you've got one graph that represents many similar sounding words. So this thing is proc, proc, prox, and poc. So the point is that in the ancient world, there's a lot of different ways to do it. And if you get one thing out of this, contra what many people say about how Chinese is an ideographic writing system, actually what they're mostly doing when they have the choice is actually writing the sound rather than the meaning. So the solution at Hlakash is a combination of methods, right? And so here's our treaty, right? Everybody gets a complete copy, and we've got a couple of things, right? So these are our name glyphs representing the sites, right? So the turtle is the oldest animal. So if you put a tree on there, it means the oldest tree, and that's Tuk'an because they claim descent from the eldest tree. Here's Darmok, Damok's oar and Chalad's spear, and the arms of Temba, and that represents an alliance, right? But it's actually pronounced Tochachos, as opposed to something like our way of writing defend, which is just writing chak, by using this raccoon tail, because the word for raccoon is hachak. And this tells you it's the thing that sounds like chak, because this is a prefix. It's the thing that sounds like chak that you do with an axe and a shield. Similarly, the snail ki nge is writing nge, 2 4 with. And so by using a combination of basic phonological cues and structural cues, right, you've got the whole on this side, meaning that somebody is going to be getting this, right? Or somebody's going to be giving this, right? And since it's you, you're giving them defense, and the thing that they're giving, right, is the forest that you want. This is the name of the forest. So as sort of an epilogue here, centuries later, right, we end up with a fairly well-developed writing system where the graphs rather than the context or the layout are doing the primary work of reducing ambiguity. So you get things like chots, right, with the indicator here. You got your spider to tell you it's got something to do with spinning. This is a textile symbol. This is actually a picture of a loom. And because spider is pronounced kichai, it writes ch. So it's a ch. And you're like, oh, it's the ch thing that has the loom, and you do it with string, and it's related to this. It's a loom. And I can go into this whole thing here. Mbe shrak koi Tuk'an ni chak we nuk chim shrak oi nge chachi, right? But only when Tuk'an reached Ngichage did he realize where he had been going. That Tuk'an allowed him to become ruler of Ngichage, but that he arrived in Ngichage and not Tolkein. was because of the journey. And so effectively, once writing systems get up and running, they tend to do a lot of the same things, but they'll always bear the legacy of the process by which they developed. And so in understanding writing and alternatives to writing, I think that conceptualizing it that way helps us kind of break out of our box and think about different things that we could potentially do. Like, what would happen if we had a society? Like, obviously, we have actual people, but like, what are other alternatives? And then, of course, by kind of doing it this way, hopefully, this helps break down some of the assumptions that people have about, especially in academia, about how complex systems develop. So hopefully it was interesting and potentially inspiring. And yeah.
Thank you so much. I know that you're already monitoring the YouTube chat due to your response to the Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra.